There are pyramids in Sudan. More pyramids, in fact, than in Egypt. Narrower and steeper than the Egyptian ones, built over a period stretching from the 8th century BCE to the 4th century CE. They rise from the desert floor at several sites along the Upper Nile in what is now northern Sudan. They are not as large as the Great Pyramids of Giza. They are not as well known. They do not appear on the covers of travel guides with the same frequency. But they are older than the Roman Empire, some of them older than the Greek classical period, and they are the monuments of a civilization that existed for more than 3,000 years in one of the most remarkable regions of the ancient African world. The civilization that built these pyramids is known to history as Nubia, and within Nubian history as the Kingdom of Kush, a complex of political entities that developed along the Upper Nile in what is now northern Sudan, in the region between the first cataract of the Nile at Aswan and the confluence of the Blue and White Nile near modern Khartoum. The Nubian world existed in a relationship of competition, exchange, influence, and occasional conquest with Egypt for nearly 3,000 years, producing civilizations that were alternately rivals, partners, and rulers of their northern neighbor. The neglect of Nubian history in the standard accounts of the ancient world is one of the more significant distortions in how the human past is typically presented. Egypt is among the most celebrated civilizations of antiquity. Nubia, which was in some periods richer than Egypt, which conquered and ruled Egypt for nearly a century, which produced a tradition of royal pyramids that outlasted the Egyptian one by more than 1,000 years, and which sustained one of the longest-running urban traditions in African history, is barely known outside the specialized community of archaeologists and historians who study it. Tonight we travel south along the Nile, past the temples that Egypt built in Nubian territory and past the ruins that Nubia built in its own, and we ask what the ancient Nubian civilizations were, how they related to the Egyptian world that overshadowed them, and what they achieved in the long centuries of their independent existence. The answer is both simpler and more surprising than the neglect of Nubian civilization in the popular historical record would suggest. The Nubian civilizations were large, sophisticated, and historically significant by any reasonable measure of those qualities. They simply existed in the shadow of Egypt, and the shadow of Egypt is very long, and past the ruins that Nubia built in its own, and we ask what the ancient Nubian civilizations were, how they related to the Egyptian world that overshadowed them, and what they achieved in the long centuries of their independent existence. Nubia's place in the history of the ancient world has been shaped as much by what later historians chose to emphasize as by the actual weight of the evidence, and correcting the distortions requires understanding how they developed. The ancient Egyptian sources, which are the most abundant textual record for Nubian history through much of the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, are not neutral. Egypt recorded its relationships with Nubia primarily in the context of military campaigns, tribute payments, and administrative control, and the specific perspective of these sources, the perspective of a dominant power recording its dealings with a subordinate region, has shaped the way Nubia has been understood by scholars who relied primarily on Egyptian evidence. The Nubian perspective on these relationships, which would have been very different, is preserved only in the much more limited documentary record that Nubia produced in its own script and language. The development of the Meroitic script, the writing system used in the later Nubian kingdom centered at Meroe, represents one of the more tantalizing unsolved problems in African epigraphy. The script has been partially deciphered in the sense that the sound values of most signs have been established, allowing Meroitic texts to be read phonetically. But the underlying language has not been identified with certainty, and the ability to read the sounds of the text does not give access to its meaning when the vocabulary and the grammar of the language remain unknown. The result is a situation analogous to the Indus Valley script. The monuments and the inscriptions of the later Nubian civilization can be seen and in some sense heard, but they cannot yet be understood in their full meaning. The physical erasure of Nubian heritage is another dimension of the neglect. The construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s and 1970s flooded a large portion of the Nubian homeland, submerging dozens of ancient sites and forcing the displacement of more than 100,000 Nubian people. The specific loss represented by the submergence of the Nubian homeland is not only archaeological. The communities that were displaced from their ancestral villages along the Nile had maintained a connection to that landscape across many generations, and the forced relocation disrupted social and cultural continuities that went far beyond what the archaeological rescue campaign could address. The human cost of the dam construction, measured in the disruption of living communities rather than simply in the loss of ancient sites, is one of the more troubling dimensions of the 20th century engagement with Nubian heritage. The International Rescue Archaeology campaign that preceded the flooding, organized by UNESCO, was one of the largest archaeological undertakings in history, but it could not fully document or preserve everything that was lost. The temples that could be moved, like Abu Simbel, were relocated at enormous expense. The sites that could not be moved were submerged, and with them went irreplaceable evidence for the human history of a region that had been inhabited continuously for more than 10,000 years. The landscape of Nubia is defined by the Nile and by the cataracts, the stretches of rapids and boulders that periodically interrupt the river's flow and that created the specific geographic structure within which Nubian civilization developed. The Nile in Nubia is not the wide, gentle river of the Egyptian delta. It is a narrower and more dramatic river, cutting through sandstone and granite in a series of gorges and rapids that divide the Upper Nile Valley into distinct segments, each with its own geographic character and its own agricultural potential. The cataracts, numbered from 1st to 6th moving upstream from Aswan, were the primary geographic features that structured the political and commercial history of the Nubian world, serving as both barriers to the movement of armies and as focal points for the communities that controlled them. The region between the 1st and 2nd cataracts, known in antiquity as Lower Nubia, was the zone of most intensive interaction between Egypt and Nubia, a zone that was alternately under Egyptian control and under Nubian control at different periods of the long history of the two civilizations. The region between the 2nd and 3rd cataracts, known as Upper Nubia or as the heartland of the Kerma kingdom, was the zone in which the earliest complex Nubian civilization developed, and the site of Kerma itself, located near the 3rd cataract, was the capital of one of the earliest African civilizations outside Egypt. The specific character of the Nubian Nile, with its dramatic landscapes of sandstone cliffs and granite outcrops, its narrow agricultural margins, and its cataracts that simultaneously connected and divided the river valley communities, gave the Nubian civilizations a geographic identity that was genuinely different from Egypt's. The broad, navigable Nile of the Egyptian delta and the Nile Valley between Aswan and the sea is a river that invites the kind of centralized agricultural state that Egypt became. The Nubian Nile, with its cataracts and its narrower agricultural margins, is a river that invites a different kind of political organization, and the specific character of the Nubian states reflects this geographic difference. Or as the heartland of the Kerma kingdom, was the zone in which the earliest complex Nubian civilization developed, and the site of Kerma itself, located near the 3rd cataract, was the capital of one of the earliest African civilizations outside Egypt. The Meroe region, located between the 5th and 6th cataracts near the confluence of the Atbara River with the main Nile, was the heartland of the later Nubian kingdom that has given its name to the most spectacular surviving monuments of the ancient Nubian world. The Meroe region receives somewhat more rainfall than the areas to the north, and the combination of Nile irrigation and seasonal rainfall made it one of the more agriculturally productive areas of the Upper Nile Valley. The iron ore deposits of the Meroe region also gave the later Nubian kingdom a technological and commercial resource that was significant in the context of the 1st millennium BCE ancient world. The Nubian landscape is one of extraordinary visual drama. The Nile cutting through sandstone cliffs whose colors shift from cream to ochre to deep red in the changing light, the narrow strips of agricultural land along the riverbanks contrasting with the absolute aridity of the desert that begins immediately beyond the reach of the floodwater, and the ancient monuments rising from the desert floor in a landscape that preserves them with the same severity that it preserved everything else that The Nile's absence denied the slow processes of biological decay. The history of Nubian archaeology is a story of gradual recognition, of the slow process by which a civilization that had been categorized as peripheral to Egypt was recognized as an independent achievement in its own right. The European exploration of Nubia in the 19th century was primarily an extension of the Egyptological enterprise rather than an independent investigation. Travelers and scholars who went south along the Nile in search of ancient monuments found them in abundance, but the interpretive framework they brought with them was one shaped by the dominance of Egyptian civilization in the scholarly imagination, and the specifically Nubian elements of what they found were often categorized as derivatives of or reactions to Egyptian influence rather than as independent achievements. The excavations of the American archaeologist George Andrew Reisner at the Nubian sites of Kerma and Nuri in the early 20th century were among the first systematic investigations of a specifically Nubian civilization rather than of Egyptian presence in Nubia, and they revealed the scale and the sophistication of the Kerma kingdom in ways that the previous framework had not prepared for. Reisner's excavation of the great tumulus burials at Kerma, the enormous earthen burial mounds that were among the largest funerary structures in the ancient African world, established the existence of a major independent civilization in Upper Nubia that had developed without direct Egyptian control. The discovery and decipherment of the Meroitic script in the late 19th century, which established that the later Nubian civilization had its own writing system rather than using the Egyptian script they had adopted earlier, was another significant step in the recognition of Nubian cultural independence. The script was recognized as phonetically decipherable in the early 20th century, but the language it records remains partially understood, and the full content of the Meroitic inscriptions that survive at sites across the former kingdom has not yet been recovered. The establishment of the Sudan Antiquities Service and the development of a professional Sudanese archaeological tradition from the mid-20th century onward, and the more recent growth of Sudanese universities with their own archaeology programs and their own research agendas, have brought new perspectives and new methodological approaches to the study of Nubian history. The institutional development of Nubian studies as a field with its own journals, its own conferences, and its own professional community has been one of the more productive dimensions of the scholarly recovery of Nubian civilization. The integration of Nubian archaeology into the broader field of African archaeology, rather than treating it primarily as an appendage to Egyptian archaeology, is a change that has brought new analytical frameworks and new comparative perspectives to the study of the Upper Nile civilizations. And the development of a professional Sudanese archaeological tradition from the mid-20th century onward, and the more recent growth of Sudanese universities with their own archaeology programs and their own research agendas, have brought new perspectives and new methodological approaches to the study of Nubian history that have significantly expanded the understanding of the civilization beyond what the earlier European-dominated scholarship could produce. The Kerma civilization, which flourished in the region of the Third Cataract from roughly 2500 to 1550 BCE, was the first great Nubian civilization and one of the most distinctive urban cultures in ancient Africa. The city of Kerma, on the east bank of the Nile near the Third Cataract, was the capital of a kingdom that at its height controlled a substantial territory along the Upper Nile and that accumulated a level of wealth and architectural ambition that is only beginning to be fully appreciated by modern archaeology. The Swiss excavations at Kerma, directed by Charles Bonnet and his successors since the 1970s, have been among the most productive long-term archaeological investigations in Africa, and the cumulative results of nearly 50 years of systematic excavation have transformed the understanding of the Kerma kingdom from a peripheral Nubian polity into a major independent civilization. The specific finds of the Swiss excavations, including the discovery of thousands of statues of New Kingdom Egyptian rulers that had been looted from Egyptian temples and deposited at Kerma in a deliberate act of political display, are among the more dramatic archaeological discoveries of recent African archaeology. Was the capital of a kingdom that at its height controlled a substantial territory along the Upper Nile and that accumulated a level of wealth and architectural ambition that is only beginning to be fully appreciated by modern archaeology. The site is dominated by two massive mud brick structures known as the Defufa, a Nubian word for the type of large mud brick religious building that is characteristic of the Kerma tradition. The Western Defufa, the larger of the two, is one of the most substantial surviving ancient mud brick structures in Africa, a massive rectangular platform of mud brick that may have served as a temple or religious center for the Kerma kingdom. The royal burials of Kerma are among the most remarkable in the ancient world. The great tumulus mounds of the Eastern Cemetery, the largest of which are more than 90 meters in diameter, were the burial places of the kings of Kerma, and the scale and the elaborateness of the burial provision they contain speaks to a society of considerable organizational capacity and considerable wealth. The largest tumulus mounds contain not only the burial of the king but the remains of hundreds of subsidiary burials, apparently individuals who were sacrificed or who died in some way associated with the burial ceremony of the king. The scale of these subsidiary burials, some tumuli containing hundreds of accompanying individuals, has no parallel in the ancient Near East and speaks to a mortuary tradition of extraordinary intensity. The ceramic tradition of Kerma is among the more technically accomplished in the ancient world. The Kerma beakers, thin-walled vessels of fired Nile clay with a characteristic black-topped red finish, were produced with a consistency and a quality that bespeaks a highly developed craft tradition, and they were traded widely across the region in ways that mark the geographic extent of Kerma's commercial influence. The specific technique that produced the black top on these vessels, involving the firing of the pot with its mouth buried in ash, is one of the more ingenious ceramic techniques of the ancient African world, and its consistent application across a large production tradition speaks to craft knowledge that was carefully maintained and transmitted. The relationship between Kerma and Egypt was one of the defining dynamics of the Middle and early New Kingdom periods, and it was considerably more complex than the Egyptian sources, which present it primarily as a series of Egyptian military victories, would suggest. During the period of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, roughly 2050 to 1650 BCE, Egypt maintained a series of fortresses in Lower Nubia designed to control the movement of people and goods along the Nile between the First and Second Cataracts. The specific character of the Egyptian administration of Lower Nubia in this period, visible in the administrative texts and the archaeological evidence from the fortress sites, was that of a colonial enterprise rather than a simple military occupation. The Egyptian administrators who staffed the Nubian fortresses managed the flow of Nubian resources northward into Egypt with considerable bureaucratic sophistication, and the cultural exchange that occurred between the Egyptian administrative community and the local Nubian population around the fortresses left traces in the material culture of both groups that speak to a relationship that was more complex and more interactive than simple colonial dominance. Egypt maintained a series of fortresses in Lower Nubia designed to control the movement of people and goods along the Nile between the First and Second Cataracts. These fortresses, built in the reign of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs and maintained through the period of Nubian expansion, were impressive military and administrative installations, and their remains, many of them now submerged beneath the waters of Lake Nasser, were among the most important archaeological sites in the region before the construction of the Aswan High Dam. The collapse of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, around 1650 BCE, created an opportunity that the Kerma kingdom exploited with considerable success. While the Hyksos, a people of Near Eastern origin, established themselves as rulers in the Egyptian Delta and Lower Egypt, the Kerma kingdom expanded northward, taking control of the Egyptian fortresses in Lower Nubia and establishing its own presence in parts of Upper Egypt. The alliance between the Hyksos rulers in the north and the Kerma kingdom in the south was one of the more interesting political configurations of the Second Intermediate Period in Egypt, and it represented a genuine threat to the Egyptian state that the later New Kingdom pharaohs would celebrate defeating in terms that convey the real fear the threat had generated. The expulsion of the Hyksos and the reunification of Egypt under the early New Kingdom pharaohs was followed by a systematic campaign to subjugate the Kerma kingdom and to establish Egyptian control over the full length of the Nile as far south as the Fourth Cataract. The New Kingdom pharaohs Ahmose, Thutmose I, and Thutmose III successively pushed Egyptian control further south, and the eventual destruction of the Kerma kingdom and its capital sometime around 1550 BCE represented the end of the independent Kerma political tradition, though the population and many aspects of the Kerma cultural tradition continued under Egyptian rule. The Egyptian period in Nubia, which lasted from the destruction of Kerma through the New Kingdom period, was characterized by the construction of a series of impressive temples in Nubian territory, including the famous rock-cut temples of Abu Simbel built by Ramesses II, and by the establishment of an administrative and economic system that extracted significant quantities of gold, cattle, and other resources from the Nubian heartland for the benefit of the Egyptian state. The material culture of the ancient Nubian civilizations gives a picture of societies that were sophisticated, aesthetically accomplished, and connected to the wider world of the ancient Near East and Africa through commercial and diplomatic relationships of considerable geographic extent. The gold of Nubia was one of the most important resources of the ancient world, and the Nile Valley south of Aswan was one of the primary gold-producing regions available to the ancient Near Eastern civilizations. The specific geography of the Nubian gold deposits, located in the desert wadis east of the Nile rather than in the river valley itself, meant that the exploitation of the gold required a combination of mining expertise, desert logistics, and administrative organization that was beyond the capacity of simple opportunistic exploitation. The management of the gold resources was one of the major economic activities of both the Egyptian administration of Nubia in the New Kingdom period and of the independent Nubian kingdoms in the periods before and after Egyptian control, and the wealth that the gold trade generated was the foundation of the material culture of the Nubian elite across the full span of the civilization's history. And the Nile Valley south of Aswan was one of the primary gold-producing regions available to the ancient Near Eastern civilizations. The Egyptian word for gold, nub, may have given the region its name, though this etymology is disputed, and the abundance of gold in the Nubian archaeological record, from the jewelry of the Kerma burials to the gold objects of the later Meroitic period, speaks to a civilization with reliable access to one of the most valued materials of the ancient world. The ivory, ebony, and animal products that moved from sub-Saharan Africa through the Nubian corridor to Egypt and the broader ancient Near East gave the Nubian kingdoms a significant role in the long-distance trade networks of the ancient world. The specific geographic position of Nubia, between the Mediterranean-connected world of Egypt and the diverse ecological zones of sub-Saharan Africa, made it a natural intermediary in the flow of exotic goods that the ancient Near Eastern elites valued and that could be obtained only through the Nubian trading networks. The ceramic tradition of the various Nubian periods, from the technically accomplished Kerma beakers of the early period to the painted pottery of the Meroitic period, shows a consistent tradition of ceramic production that expressed specifically Nubian aesthetic values while also incorporating influences from the Egyptian and Hellenistic traditions with which the later Nubian kingdoms were in sustained contact. The specific combination of Nubian, Egyptian, and Greek artistic elements in the material culture of the Meroitic period speaks to a civilization that was actively engaged with the wider Mediterranean world while maintaining a specifically African cultural identity. The elephants that appear repeatedly in the art and the religious iconography of the later Nubian kingdoms, from the carved reliefs of Meroitic temples to the bronze vessels of the elite burials, speak to a civilization that maintained its connections to the sub-Saharan world throughout its history. The elephant was not merely an exotic animal to the Nubian kings. It was a symbol of royal power, of the specific environment of the Upper Nile, and of the connection between the Nubian kingdom and the African world to its south that gave the kingdom part of its distinctive identity. The Napatan kingdom, which emerged in the region of the Fourth Cataract around 900 BCE after a period in which the archaeological record of independent Nubian political organization is less clear, represents one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of the ancient world. The Napatan kingdom developed in the region around the sacred mountain of Gebel Barkal, a striking sandstone butte rising from the Nile Valley floor near the Fourth Cataract that was understood in the Napatan religious tradition as a particularly sacred place, associated with the Nubian form of the Egyptian god Ammonius. The specific character of the Gebel Barkal cult, which identified the mountain as the southern throne of Ammonius and as the place from which the god exercised his authority over the world, gave the Napatan kingdom a specific religious legitimacy that was simultaneously connected to the Egyptian Ammonius tradition and grounded in the specific Nubian landscape of the Fourth Cataract region. The Nubian kings who built their temples at the base of Gebel Barkal were not simply copying Egyptian religious practice. They were making a specific claim that the authority of Ammonius was as much Nubian as Egyptian, and that the rightful guardians of his cult were the kings of Napata rather than the pharaohs of the Nile Delta. A striking sandstone butte rising from the Nile Valley floor near the Fourth Cataract that was understood in the Napatan religious tradition as a particularly sacred place, associated with the Nubian form of the Egyptian god Ammonius. The temples built at the base of Gebel Barkal, and the specific relationship between the mountain and the royal cult of the Napatan kings, gave the site a religious significance that made it the most important cult center of the Napatan kingdom and one of the most significant religious sites in the ancient African world. The political achievement of the Napatan kings in the late 8th century BCE was the conquest of Egypt itself. The Nubian king Pi, ruling from Napata in the 25th year of his reign around 728 BCE, led his army northward along the Nile, subduing the various local rulers who had been competing for power in the divided Egypt of the late Third Intermediate Period, and presenting himself as the righteous restorer of the proper order of the Egyptian state and the proper worship of the Egyptian god Ammonius. The account of this campaign, preserved on the victory stele of Pi, which was erected at Gebel Barkal and is now one of the more important historical documents in the Nubian archaeological record, describes a campaign conducted with considerable military skill and considerable religious conviction. Pi's successors, including Shabaka, Shabitku, Taharka, and Tantamani, ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty from roughly 716 to 656 BCE, maintaining their power through a combination of military force and religious legitimacy and engaging with the wider world of the ancient Near East in ways that brought Nubia into direct confrontation with the expanding Assyrian Empire. The reign of Taharka, the most celebrated of the Nubian pharaohs, was a period of considerable building activity in both Egypt and Nubia and of active diplomatic and military engagement with the powers of the Near East, including the episode described in the Hebrew Bible in which an Ethiopian army is credited with forcing the Assyrian army of Sennacherib to withdraw from its siege of Jerusalem. The 25th dynasty, the period of Nubian rule over Egypt, is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the political history of the ancient world, and its relative obscurity in the popular understanding of ancient history is one of the more telling examples of the neglect of Nubian civilization. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty ruled Egypt as entirely legitimate pharaohs in the Egyptian sense. They adopted Egyptian royal titulary, built and restored temples in the Egyptian style, worshipped the Egyptian gods alongside the Nubian ones, and represented themselves in art and inscription in the full conventions of Egyptian royal imagery. The specific building program of the 25th dynasty kings in Egypt was among the most ambitious of any dynasty in the late period. Taharka in particular was a prolific builder, constructing and restoring temples at Karnak, Memphis, and dozens of other sites across Egypt, and the quality of the work produced under his patronage was as high as any in the long history of Egyptian monumental construction. The restoration of neglected temples and the revival of lapsed religious traditions were among the specific ways in which the Nubian pharaohs asserted their legitimacy as guardians of the Egyptian religious heritage. In the Egyptian sense, they adopted Egyptian royal titulary, built and restored temples in the Egyptian style, worshipped the Egyptian gods alongside the Nubian ones, and represented themselves in art and inscription in the full conventions of Egyptian royal imagery. The specific religious conviction that drove the Nubian conquests of Egypt was a conviction that the Nubian kings were the rightful protectors of the Ammonius cult, which they believed had been neglected and compromised by the local Egyptian rulers of the Third Intermediate Period, and the ideological framework of the conquest was as much religious restoration as military takeover. The colossal statues and the building inscriptions left by the 25th dynasty kings at sites across Egypt speak to rulers who were genuinely engaged with the Egyptian cultural tradition and who understood themselves as operating within it rather than imposing something foreign upon it. The black granite statues of Taharka and his predecessors, with their specifically Nubian physiognomy combined with the full regalia of Egyptian royal iconography, are among the most remarkable royal portraits to survive from the ancient world, and they speak of rulers who were simultaneously asserting their Egyptian legitimacy and their Nubian identity. The confrontation between the Nubian pharaohs and the Assyrian Empire under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, which ultimately drove the Nubian dynasty from Egypt, was one of the defining military conflicts of the 7th century BCE. The Assyrian army, the most formidable military force in the ancient Near East, invaded Egypt in 671 BCE and defeated Taharqa, establishing Assyrian control over the Delta and Upper Egypt. Subsequent Nubian attempts to reassert control over Egypt were repulsed by the Assyrians, and by 656 BCE the last Nubian ruler of Egypt, Tantamani, had withdrawn permanently to Nubia. The period of Nubian rule over Egypt was over, but the Nubian kingdom itself continued in its heartland, maintaining its traditions and eventually developing into the Meroitic kingdom that would sustain Nubian civilization for another 1,000 years. The Meroitic kingdom, which succeeded the Napatan kingdom as the primary form of Nubian political organization from roughly the 5th century BCE onward, represents the fullest flowering of independent Nubian civilization. The shift of the political center from Napata near the Fourth Cataract to Meroe near the confluence of the Atbara with the Nile, which appears to have occurred gradually during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, brought the Nubian kingdom into a different geographic and ecological zone. The specific reasons for the shift of the political center southward from Napata to Meroe are not entirely clear from the available evidence. One influential hypothesis proposes that the increasing pressure of Egyptian and then Macedonian power in the north made a more southerly capital strategically preferable. Another hypothesis emphasizes the greater agricultural and industrial resources of the Meroe region, including the rainfall and the iron ore deposits, as economic incentives for the southward shift. The most likely explanation involves a combination of both strategic and economic factors operating over a period of several generations. Near the confluence of the Atbara with the Nile, which appears to have occurred gradually during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, brought the Nubian kingdom into a different geographic and ecological zone. The Meroe region, with its somewhat greater rainfall and its iron ore deposits, gave the kingdom new resources and new economic possibilities, and the development of the iron smelting industry at Meroe made the city one of the major centers of iron production in the ancient world. The iron slag heaps that survive at the Meroe site speak to an industrial activity of considerable scale, and the iron tools and weapons produced there were traded across a wide area of northeastern Africa. The pyramids of Meroe, which are the most visually striking surviving monuments of the Meroitic kingdom, are different in form from the Egyptian pyramids that inspired them. They are steeper, with slopes of approximately 65 degrees compared to the 52 degrees of the Giza pyramids, and they are smaller, with bases ranging from roughly 15 to 30 meters on a side. They are built over burial chambers cut into the rock below them, and their exterior surfaces were originally faced with smooth-cut stone that gave them a sharp, geometric profile. A small chapel attached to the east face of each pyramid served for the ritual activities associated with the royal cult, and the painted and carved reliefs in these chapels are among the most important surviving examples of Meroitic religious art. The specific political and administrative organization of the Meroitic kingdom is documented in both the textual and the archaeological record, though the undeciphered nature of the Meroitic language means that the documentary evidence is less accessible than the administrative records of comparable ancient civilizations. The kingdom was ruled by a king, known in Meroitic texts by a title that Greek sources translate as the Kandake, and the specific roles of different royal officials, priests, and administrative personnel are documented in the relief carvings and in the Greek and Latin sources that describe the kingdom from the outside. The role of women in the Meroitic kingdom is one of the more distinctive features of the civilization, and it is documented in both the visual and the textual record in ways that speak to a society in which royal women exercised significant political authority. The Kandake, often translated as Queen Mother or Queen Regent but apparently a specific royal title in the Meroitic political system, appears in the historical record as a figure of genuine political power rather than simply a consort or a ceremonial figure. The specific constitutional role of the Kandake in the Meroitic political system is one of the more interesting questions in Nubian studies. The evidence from the Greek and Latin sources, which describe Meroitic queens in terms that suggest genuine autonomous authority, is consistent with a political tradition in which the most senior royal woman held a specific constitutional position that was not dependent on her relationship to any particular king. The comparison with the Hittite Tawananna, who also held her position for life and exercised specific independent authority within the Hittite political system, suggests that this kind of female constitutional role was not unique to the Nubian world but may reflect a broader ancient Near Eastern and African tradition of institutionalized female royal authority. But apparently a specific royal title in the Meroitic political system appears in the historical record as a figure of genuine political power rather than simply a consort or a ceremonial figure. The Roman sources that describe the kingdom of Meroe in the 1st century BCE include references to a fierce Kandake who led resistance to Roman expansion into Nubian territory during the period of Augustus, and the specific characterization of this figure in the Roman sources, as a warrior queen who directed military campaigns and negotiated with Rome, speaks to a political tradition in which royal women could exercise autonomous military and diplomatic authority. The colossal reliefs on the temples and pyramids of the Meroitic kingdom show female royal figures in poses of royal authority that are uncommon in the art of other ancient civilizations. The large female figures on the pylon of the temple at Naka, showing a queen in the act of smiting enemies in the traditional Egyptian royal pose, is one of the most striking examples. The figure is shown at the same scale as the king in the adjacent panel, her body rounded in a specifically Meroitic aesthetic that differs from the idealized slimness of Egyptian royal portraiture, and the posture and the action are those of a warrior ruler rather than a consort. Whether these images represent specific historical queens who exercised military power or are representations of a generalized royal authority that could be embodied by female rulers as well as male ones is a question that the sources address ambiguously. The grave goods of the royal and elite burials of the Meroitic period show women interred with the full range of symbols of royal and aristocratic status, including weapons, crowns, and the administrative insignia of authority, in ways that do not distinguish sharply between the burial provision of male and female high-status individuals. This burial evidence is consistent with a society in which gender did not determine the range of authority available to high-ranking individuals in the way that it did in many contemporary civilizations. The connections between the Meroitic kingdom and the wider world of the ancient Mediterranean and the African continent place the Nubian civilization within a network of relationships that has been insufficiently recognized in the standard accounts of the ancient world. The Greek and Roman engagement with the Meroitic kingdom is documented in both the classical sources and in the material culture recovered from Meroitic sites. Greek pottery appears at Meroe from the Hellenistic period onward, and the specific influence of Greek artistic conventions on Meroitic religious and royal art is visible in the combination of Egyptian and Greek stylistic elements that characterizes the Meroitic visual tradition. The specific geographic position of Meroe, at the meeting point of the Nile trade route, the Red Sea trade route via the Atbara River, and the overland routes into the sub-Saharan interior, gave the city a commercial significance that attracted the attention of the Hellenistic and Roman worlds as they extended their commercial reach into the Indian Ocean and the African interior. The Meroitic kingdom's control of the gateway to sub-Saharan Africa made it a commercial partner that Rome could not afford to ignore, and the peace that was established after Petronius's campaign gave both sides the commercial access they wanted without the costs of sustained military conflict. Is documented in both the classical sources and in the material culture recovered from Meroitic sites. The city of Meroe apparently had a substantial Greek merchant community at some point in the Hellenistic period, and the specific mechanisms through which Greek cultural influence reached Meroe, whether through direct trade, through diplomatic contact, or through the intermediary of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, are a matter of ongoing research. The Roman military expedition into Nubia under the prefect Gaius Petronius in 24 BCE, which was a response to a Meroitic raid into Roman-controlled Egypt, reached as far south as Napata before withdrawing. The subsequent treaty between Rome and Meroe, apparently negotiated in part by the Candake who had directed the original raid, established a peace that lasted for several centuries and that facilitated the commercial contact between the Roman world and the Meroitic kingdom that is documented in the distribution of Roman goods at Meroitic sites. The specific terms of the treaty and the specific character of the subsequent Roman-Meroitic relationship are documented in both Greco-Roman sources and in the archaeological evidence for Roman goods in Meroitic contexts. The connections between the Meroitic kingdom and the sub-Saharan African world to its south and west are less well documented but clearly significant. The elephant imagery in Meroitic art, the presence of specifically African animal species in the iconography of the kingdom, and the evidence for trade goods moving from the sub-Saharan interior through Meroitic territory all speak to a civilization that maintained its connections to the broader African world while also engaging intensively with the Mediterranean civilizations to its north. The specific role of Meroe as an intermediary between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world is one of the more important but less well understood dimensions of its historical significance. The decline and eventual collapse of the Meroitic kingdom, which occurred around the 4th century CE, is another chapter in the Nubian story that the evidence addresses only partially. The traditional account, derived primarily from the Aksumite sources that celebrated the victory of the Ethiopian kingdom of Aksum over Meroe, proposes that the Meroitic kingdom was destroyed by a military campaign of the Aksumite king Izana around 350 CE. The specific relationship between the Meroitic kingdom and the kingdom of Aksum in the centuries before the conquest is an important but incompletely documented dimension of the history of both civilizations. Aksum was a rising power in the Horn of Africa, benefiting from its position on the Red Sea trade routes that were increasingly important in the late Roman period. The competition between Aksum and Meroe for the trade of the East African interior and for the political influence over the communities of the Upper Nile and the Ethiopian highlands, was one of the defining dynamics of the region in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. That celebrated the victory of the Ethiopian kingdom of Aksum over Meroe, proposes that the Meroitic kingdom was destroyed by a military campaign of the Aksumite king Izana around 350 CE. The Izana inscription, found at Aksum, describes a campaign against the peoples of the Upper Nile in terms that have been interpreted as referring to a conquest of Meroe, and the archaeological evidence for destruction and abandonment at Meroitic sites in the 4th century CE is broadly consistent with this account. The longer-term factors that weakened the Meroitic kingdom before the Aksumite conquest may have been as important as the specific military event. The trade routes that had sustained the kingdom's commercial wealth were shifting in the 4th century CE as new maritime routes in the Red Sea began to bypass the overland Nile trade that had been the foundation of Nubian commercial importance for millennia. The environmental pressure on the agricultural systems of the Upper Nile, and the competition from the nomadic pastoralist groups who were increasingly active in the Nubian region in this period, may also have contributed to the gradual weakening of the Meroitic state. The population of the Meroitic kingdom did not disappear with the political structure of the kingdom. The people of the Upper Nile Valley continued to inhabit the region, and their subsequent history, visible in the archaeological evidence for the post-Meroitic cultures that developed in the same area in the 5th and 6th centuries CE, shows continuities with the Meroitic tradition alongside significant changes in material culture and social organization. The introduction of Christianity into the Nubian kingdoms in the 6th century CE, brought by missionaries from Byzantium, represents the next major transformation in the long cultural history of the Nile Valley south of Aswan, and the Christian Nubian kingdoms that developed in the medieval period represent a further chapter in a story of continuous inhabitation and cultural development that stretches from the Kerma period to the present. The mystery at the heart of Nubian civilization is why it has been so consistently overlooked in the standard accounts of the ancient world, and what the recovery of its full significance requires. The neglect of Nubian history is not simply a matter of ignorance or of the accidental gaps in the evidence. It reflects specific choices made by specific scholars at specific moments about what counted as significant in the ancient world and whose achievements deserved to be remembered. The process of correcting these choices is not simply a matter of adding more information to the existing framework. It requires rethinking the framework itself, questioning the assumptions about geographic and cultural significance that have shaped the standard accounts of ancient history, and being willing to acknowledge that those accounts have been systematically incomplete in ways that are not accidents of evidence but products of specific intellectual traditions with specific blind spots. Nubian history is one of the clearest examples of what those blind spots have cost, or of the accidental gaps in the evidence. The dominant framework of ancient world history, which was developed in the 18th and 19th centuries by European scholars working primarily with Greek, Roman, and Egyptian sources, treated the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean as the relevant frame of reference and treated Africa south of Egypt as essentially irrelevant to that story. The specific ideological dimensions of this framework, the degree to which it was shaped by contemporary assumptions about the relative capacities of different peoples and different continents, are not subtle. The civilization of Kerma, which was building its massive mud brick temples and its enormous royal tumuli at the same time that the Middle Kingdom pharaohs were maintaining their Nubian frontier fortresses, was described in the Egyptological literature of the early 20th century in terms that reflected the interpretive assumptions of colonial-era scholarship rather than the actual evidence for the sophistication and the ambition of the Kerma tradition. The recovery of Nubian history from this framework requires more than simply adding Nubian material to existing accounts of the ancient world. It requires rethinking the geographic and cultural framework within which ancient history is presented, acknowledging Africa south of Egypt as a zone of genuine historical significance, and engaging with the specific achievements of the Nubian civilizations on their own terms rather than primarily as appendages to or derivatives of the Egyptian tradition that has dominated the standard account. The archaeological evidence for the Nubian civilizations is substantial enough to support this rethinking. The pyramids of Meroe, the temples of Naka and Musaweret, the painted tombs of the Napatan and Meroitic elites, the ceramic traditions that span more than 2,000 years of Nubian cultural history. All of this is material evidence for a civilization of genuine importance, and the scholarly work of recovering its significance is ongoing. The comparison between the Nubian civilizations and Egypt illuminates the complex relationship between these two major African civilizations and the specific ways in which each shaped the other. The Egyptian influence on Nubia is visible and pervasive across the long history of the relationship. The Nubian kings of the Napatan and Meroitic periods adopted Egyptian writing, Egyptian religious iconography, Egyptian architectural forms, and Egyptian royal titulary. The specific way in which Nubian architects and artists transformed the Egyptian models they adopted is one of the more interesting dimensions of the Nubian cultural tradition. The steeper pyramids of Meroe, narrower and more dramatic than their Egyptian antecedents, are the most visible example. The specific Meroitic rendering of Egyptian deities, which gave familiar Egyptian divine figures a specifically African physical character, is another. These are not the copies of an imitative tradition. They are the adaptations of a tradition that had absorbed an external influence and made it its own. The Nubian kings of the Napatan and Meroitic periods adopted Egyptian writing, Egyptian religious iconography, Egyptian architectural forms, and Egyptian royal titulary, and the temples they built at sites across Nubia are in the Egyptian architectural tradition, using Egyptian column forms and Egyptian pylon facades and Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions. This adoption of Egyptian cultural forms was not the imitation of a conquered people. It was the deliberate appropriation by a politically independent civilization of the prestige culture of its most important neighbor, in the same way that later civilizations would appropriate the prestigious cultural forms of Rome or Greece. The Nubian influence on Egypt is less often acknowledged but equally real. The gold, the ivory, the exotic animals, and the other African products that moved through the Nubian trade networks into Egypt were essential to the specific luxury culture and the specific religious practices of the Egyptian state, and the disruption of these supply lines, whenever it occurred, was felt as a genuine economic and cultural loss by the Egyptian elite. The specifically Nubian aesthetic elements that appear in Egyptian art of the New Kingdom period, including the representation of Nubian people and Nubian goods in Egyptian tomb paintings, speak to a cultural influence that went in both directions. The specific period of Nubian rule over Egypt as the 25th dynasty represents the ultimate inversion of the usual power relationship between the two civilizations, and the response of the Egyptian cultural tradition to this inversion is itself instructive. The later Egyptian sources, and the standard accounts of ancient Egyptian history derived from them, tend to minimize or ignore the 25th dynasty, presenting it as a foreign intrusion into the Egyptian story rather than as one of the legitimate phases of Egyptian political history. The specific political genealogy that would make the 25th dynasty central to rather than marginal to the standard account of ancient Egypt has not been fully worked out, and the implications of doing so for how Egypt is understood as a civilization in the context of its African world are significant. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia across 3,000 years of interaction is one of the most complex and most consequential relationships in the history of the ancient world, and its full recovery requires the development of an analytical framework that treats both civilizations as genuine actors rather than assigning one of them the role of the subordinate other. What makes the Nubian civilizations different from other ancient civilizations is the specific combination of their African identity, their sustained engagement with the Mediterranean world, and their production of a tradition of monumental architecture that outlasted the Egyptian one by more than 1,000 years. The pyramids of Meroe are the clearest symbol of this combination. They are distinctly African in their setting, rising from the desert of the upper Nile Valley in a landscape that has nothing Mediterranean about it, and they are the burial places of African rulers whose primary frame of reference was the African world of the upper Nile. The specific aesthetic of the Meroitic pyramids, with their steep profiles and their small attached chapels, reflects a tradition of royal commemoration that had been developing in Nubia for centuries before the Meroitic period. The Napatan kings of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE had built the first Nubian pyramids at El Kuru and Nuri, adapting the Egyptian pyramid form to a specifically Nubian scale and context, and the Meroitic tradition of pyramid building continued and extended this Napatan precedent across nearly 1,000 years of royal burials. The tradition was deliberately maintained, each new generation of kings building their pyramids in the same general style as their predecessors, and the specific choice to continue building in this form across such a long period speaks to the cultural importance that the tradition held. But they are also monuments to a specific cultural tradition borrowed from Egypt, adapted and transformed by the Nubian tradition, and maintained long after the original Egyptian tradition that inspired them had ceased to be practiced. The last Meroitic pyramid was built in the 4th century CE, more than 2,000 years after the last Egyptian royal pyramid and at a time when the Roman Empire was converting to Christianity. This specific combination of African setting and identity with a long-sustained engagement with the broader cultural world of the ancient Mediterranean gives the Nubian civilizations a place in world history that is both specifically African and genuinely global. The Nubian kings who built their pyramids at Meroe were part of the same ancient world that produced the Temple of Zeus at Olympia and the Senate of Rome, and they were in commercial and diplomatic contact with that world, but they were doing something specifically their own in a specifically African landscape, and the tradition they maintained was neither a derivative of Egyptian civilization nor a pale reflection of the Mediterranean world. It was something genuinely independent. The duration of the Nubian urban tradition is another feature that makes it distinctive. The continuous sequence of urban civilization along the Upper Nile, from the Kerma period beginning around 2500 BCE to the end of the Meroitic period around 350 CE, spans almost 3,000 years. No other urban tradition in sub-Saharan Africa has a comparable antiquity or a comparable continuity, and the specific achievement of maintaining a complex urban civilization in the challenging environment of the Upper Nile Valley across this immense span of time is one that deserves recognition as one of the great achievements of African history. The religious life of the Nubian civilizations was a complex synthesis of indigenous African traditions and Egyptian religious culture, and the specific character of that synthesis gives important evidence for the nature of Nubian cultural identity. The worship of Ammonius at Gebel Barkal, the sacred mountain near Napata that was understood as the primordial mound from which Ammonius had emerged at the beginning of time, was the central cult of the Napatan kingdom and remained important through the Meroitic period. The specific character of the Gebel Barkal cult, with its identification of the mountain as the southern throne of Ammonius and its claim that the authority of Ammonius was rooted in Nubian soil as much as in Egyptian soil, gave the Nubian kings a religious legitimacy that was simultaneously connected to the dominant religious tradition of the ancient Near East and specifically grounded in the Nubian landscape. This specific religious strategy, of claiming rather than rejecting the prestige of the dominant cultural tradition while insisting that the deepest sources of that tradition were Nubian rather than Egyptian, is one of the more sophisticated cultural moves in the history of the ancient world. That was understood as the primordial mound from which Ammonius had emerged at the beginning of time, was the central cult of the Napatan kingdom and remained important through the Meroitic period. The Nubian adoption and adaptation of the Egyptian Ammonius cult was not simply a case of religious borrowing from a more culturally powerful neighbor. It was a deliberate act of religious appropriation by which the Nubian kings claimed a specific religious legitimacy that was simultaneously Egyptian in its form and specifically Nubian in its grounding at the sacred mountain of Gebel Barkal. The specifically Nubian deity Apidmak, a lion-headed war god who has no counterpart in the Egyptian pantheon, is one of the clearest markers of the independent religious tradition that coexisted with the adopted Egyptian elements in Nubian religious culture. Apidmak is depicted at multiple Meroitic temple sites in reliefs of considerable scale and quality, shown receiving the tribute and the devotion of the Meroitic kings in scenes that parallel the Egyptian representations of pharaonic piety toward the Egyptian gods, but that are specifically Nubian in their subject. The existence and the prominence of Apidmak in the Meroitic religious tradition is evidence that the Nubian adoption of Egyptian religious forms was selective and transformative rather than wholesale, and that specifically African religious traditions maintained their place in the Nubian religious world alongside the borrowed Egyptian ones. The religious architecture of the Meroitic period, including the temples at Naka, Musaweret es Sufra, and other sites in the Meroe region, shows the specific combination of Egyptian architectural forms with Nubian religious content that characterizes the Meroitic synthesis. The Great Temple of Musaweret es Sufra, with its enormous enclosure and its elephant iconography, is one of the most distinctive religious structures in the ancient world, a monument to a specifically African religious tradition that has no parallel in either the Egyptian or the Mediterranean worlds. The archaeology of ancient Nubia continues to produce new evidence and new understanding, and the pace of discovery has accelerated significantly in the past several decades as new methods and new research programs have been brought to bear on the evidence. The German excavations at Meroe, the Sudanese and international investigations at Kerma, and the wide range of survey and excavation projects being conducted across the territory of the former Nubian kingdoms have produced an increasingly detailed picture of the ancient civilization's material culture, its urban organization, and its connections to the surrounding world. The specific contribution of each major excavation to the overall picture has been cumulative and complementary. The Swiss excavations at Kerma have illuminated the early phase of Nubian civilization and the character of the first great Nubian capital. The German and Sudanese excavations at Meroe have revealed the scale and the sophistication of the later Nubian urban tradition. The survey work across the Nubian landscape has filled in the picture of the settlement pattern and the agricultural economy that sustained both traditions across their long histories, and the wide range of survey and excavation projects being conducted across the territory of the former Nubian kingdoms have produced an increasingly detailed picture of the ancient civilization's material culture, its urban organization, and its connections to the surrounding world. Each new excavation season adds to the corpus of evidence, and the accumulating picture is one of considerable complexity and sophistication. The application of ancient DNA analysis to Nubian skeletal remains is beginning to address questions about the genetic history of the Nubian population and its relationships to the populations of Egypt to the north and sub-Saharan Africa to the south. The results are preliminary but are already producing evidence for the specific population history of the Upper Nile Valley that complements the archaeological and historical evidence in important ways. The survey of the Nubian landscape using satellite remote sensing and LiDAR technology is revealing the extent of ancient settlement and agricultural activity across the Nubian region in ways that ground-level survey could not achieve, and the picture that emerges from this survey is of a more densely populated and more intensively managed landscape than the standard accounts of Nubian history have suggested. The identification of ancient agricultural systems, field boundaries, and settlement patterns across the desert landscape of the Upper Nile gives a more complete picture of the human geography of ancient Nubia than was previously available. The ongoing investigation of the Meroitic script and language, using new computational methods and new comparative linguistic approaches, is making slow progress toward the goal of understanding the language that the script encodes. The specific linguistic connections between Meroitic and other African language families are being investigated with increasing sophistication, and while a full decipherment remains some way off, the progress being made suggests that the Meroitic language will eventually be understood, opening a direct window into the self-understanding of the last great Nubian civilization. What modern archaeology and scholarship have established about the Nubian civilizations over the past century has substantially transformed the understanding of ancient African history. The excavation of Kerma, first by Reisner and then by later Swiss and Sudanese teams, has established the scale and the sophistication of the Kerma civilization in ways that make it impossible to treat as a simple precursor to or derivative of the Egyptian civilizations that were its contemporaries. The Kerma beakers in their technical perfection, the Defufa in its architectural ambition, the great tumulus burials in their organizational scale. These are the products of a civilization that was genuinely independent, genuinely accomplished, and genuinely significant in the history of the ancient world. The excavation and study of the Napatan and Meroitic sites, and particularly the increasing attention paid to the Meroitic kingdom as a complex, cosmopolitan civilization rather than a simple continuation of earlier Nubian traditions, has given a much richer and more differentiated picture of the later phases of Nubian history. The specific character of the Meroitic kingdom, with its mixture of Egyptian, Greek, and specifically African cultural elements, its tradition of politically active royal women, and its sustained urban tradition in the challenging environment of the Upper Nile, is emerging as one of the more interesting civilizations of the first millennium BCE and early Common Era. The integration of Nubian history into the broader history of the ancient world, and the recognition that the ancient world extended well beyond the Mediterranean and the Fertile Crescent to include the civilizations of the Upper Nile, is a process that is still incomplete in the popular understanding of history, but that is increasingly well established in the scholarly literature. The publication of major excavation reports, the development of major museum exhibitions focused on Nubian civilization, and the growing presence of Nubian history in the curricula of universities in both Sudan and the broader international scholarly community all speak to the gradual recovery of a civilization that deserves a much more prominent place in the standard accounts of human achievement. The specific contribution of Sudanese and Nubian scholars to the study of their own civilization's history is an important dimension of this recovery that deserves recognition. The development of indigenous archaeological traditions and historical scholarship that can engage with the Nubian past from the perspective of the communities that are its direct descendants is one of the more promising developments in the field, and the voices it brings to the interpretation of the evidence are ones that the earlier European-dominated scholarship systematically excluded. The development of the field of Nubian studies into a genuinely international and multi-perspectival discipline is one of the more encouraging developments in the broader project of recovering the full scope of ancient human achievement. The specific contributions of scholars from Sudan, from Egypt, from France, Germany, the United States, and a growing range of other countries, working together at sites across the former Nubian kingdoms, represent a model of collaborative international scholarship that is producing results that no single national tradition could achieve alone. What remains uncertain about the Nubian civilizations encompasses some of the most fundamental questions about their inner life and their historical significance. The Meroitic language remains the central uncertainty. The inability to read the texts that the Meroitic civilization produced in its own tongue means that the specific content of Meroitic religious belief, political ideology, and historical self-understanding is not directly accessible. The comparison between the situation of the Meroitic language and that of other undeciphered ancient scripts is instructive. The Indus script and Linear A both present the same fundamental obstacle: a script that can be partially read but a language that cannot be understood. In each case, the civilization left a rich material record that allows many aspects of its history and culture to be reconstructed, but the specific inner life of the civilization, what it believed, what stories it told about itself, what it understood about its own history, remains locked in the undeciphered script. The Meroitic situation may eventually be resolved by comparative linguistic work that identifies the language's relationship to other African language families, and this possibility keeps the prospect of a fuller understanding of the civilization alive. The comparison with what became known about the Hittites after their language was deciphered, or about the Harappans if their script were ever decoded, gives a sense of how transformative the decipherment of Meroitic would be for the understanding of the civilization. The specific political organization of the various Nubian kingdoms across their long history is another area of genuine uncertainty. The administrative structure of the Kerma kingdom, the specific relationship between the Napatan kings and the priests of Ammonius who apparently exercised significant authority at Gebel Barkal, and the specific constitutional role of the Kandake in the Meroitic political system are all questions that the evidence addresses only partially. The interpretive challenge is compounded by the fact that the primary documentary sources for much of Nubian history are Egyptian rather than Nubian, and the Egyptian perspective on the political organization of the Nubian states was shaped by the specific nature of Egypt's relationship with its southern neighbor. The pre-Kerma history of the Upper Nile, the deep background of the cultures from which the Kerma civilization emerged, is another area where the evidence is suggestive but incomplete. The Neolithic and pre-Neolithic archaeological record of the Upper Nile region shows a long sequence of human occupation and cultural development that stretches back well before the Kerma period, and the specific processes by which the complex Kerma civilization emerged from this deeper background are only beginning to be understood. The connections between the Nubian civilizations and the broader African world, including the sub-Saharan communities to the south and west, are an area where the archaeological evidence is growing but where the interpretation of the evidence remains at an early stage. The specific economic, cultural, and political relationships between Meroe and the communities of the East African interior, the Horn of Africa, and the West African savanna are questions that the evidence raises without yet fully answering. The Nubian civilizations change how we think about Africa and about the geographic and cultural framework within which the ancient world should be understood. The most immediate implication is geographic. The ancient world extended further into Africa than the standard accounts acknowledge, and the civilizations of the Upper Nile were participants in the broader history of the ancient world rather than peripheral observers of it. The specific geographic argument for the inclusion of Nubia in the standard account of the ancient world is not difficult to make. The Upper Nile is connected to the Mediterranean by the Nile itself, one of the great transportation routes of the ancient world. The Nubian kingdoms were in regular commercial and diplomatic contact with Egypt, with the Hellenistic world, and with Rome. The movement of goods, people, and ideas along the Nile connected the Upper Nile Valley to the broader ancient world in ways that make the exclusion of Nubia from the standard account not a geographic necessity but a specific choice with specific consequences for the completeness of the historical picture. The ancient world extended further into Africa than the standard accounts acknowledge, and the civilizations of the Upper Nile were participants in the broader history of the ancient world, rather than peripheral observers of it. The Nubian kings who corresponded with Roman emperors, who traded with Ptolemaic Egypt, and who built pyramids in the style of the Pharaohs, were engaged with the Mediterranean world in ways that make them as much part of ancient world history as the kingdoms of Anatolia or the city-states of the Levant. The broader implication is for the understanding of African history and of Africa's place in world history. The standard narrative of world history has consistently underrepresented Africa south of Egypt, treating the continent as peripheral to the major developments in human civilization rather than as a zone of genuine historical significance. The evidence from Nubia, from the long tradition of urban civilization along the Upper Nile, challenges this representation directly. A civilization that maintained complex urban life for 3,000 years, that produced monumental architecture of considerable ambition, that engaged in sustained diplomatic and commercial relationships with the Mediterranean world, and that ruled Egypt itself for nearly a century is not a peripheral civilization. It is a central one, and the framework that has made it appear peripheral is one that requires revision. The specific lesson of Nubian history for the present is connected to this broader point about historical representation. The recovery of the Nubian past is not simply an academic exercise in filling gaps in the historical record. It is part of the larger project of developing a genuinely global understanding of human history, one that takes seriously the contributions of civilizations from all parts of the world rather than privileging the specific civilizations that have left the most abundant documentary record in the languages that the dominant scholarly traditions have been most equipped to read. The pyramids of Meroe, still standing in the Sudanese desert after 2,000 years of exposure to wind and sand and the occasional depredations of treasure hunters, are a physical argument for this revision. They are evidence of achievement, of ambition, of the sustained commitment of a specific civilization to a specific tradition of monumental expression across a very long period of time. They deserve to be known. The people of ancient Nubia were fully human in every dimension, and the evidence they left behind allows something of that humanity to be glimpsed even across the distances of time and the barriers of language that separate them from the present. The Victory Stele of Pi, erected at Gebel Barkal to commemorate the conquest of Egypt, is among the more remarkable personal documents to survive from the ancient world. Pi was clearly a man of strong convictions, and the text of the stele, which describes the campaign in considerable detail, gives an unusual sense of a specific individual's religious conviction and his sense of his own historical role. The specific voice that the Victory Stele preserves, of a king who understood himself as acting from genuine religious conviction and who was capable of expressing that conviction in specific and personal terms, is one that the Nubian tradition does not often allow to be heard in this directness. Most of what survives from the Nubian civilizations is architectural and visual rather than textual, and the specific personal dimension of the historical record that texts can preserve is therefore largely missing from the picture of the Nubian world. The Victory Stele is one of the exceptions, and it is a genuinely remarkable document. To commemorate the conquest of Egypt is among the more remarkable personal documents to survive from the ancient world. The specific passage in which Pi refuses to meet with the defeated Egyptian rulers because they had eaten fish and were therefore ritually impure, while accepting the surrender of a queen because she was not similarly polluted, speaks to a king who took the specific obligations of his religious tradition absolutely seriously and who was not prepared to compromise them even at a moment of supreme political triumph. The Meroitic royal women who appear in the temple reliefs at Naka, depicted in the act of smiting enemies in the traditional pose of Egyptian royal power, are figures of genuine historical weight even though their specific names and their specific stories are not yet fully accessible. The physical presence that the sculptors gave them, their large bodies and their direct gaze and the specific power of the smiting pose, speaks of a tradition that understood female royal authority as genuine and worthy of commemoration in the most enduring medium available. The craftspeople who produced the Kerma beakers, throwing those thin-walled vessels on a wheel with the skill that 5,000 years of subsequent archaeology has recognized as extraordinary, were doing what craftspeople do in every period and every culture, applying accumulated knowledge and personal skill to the production of specific objects for specific purposes, and in the process making something that has outlasted them by 5,000 years and that continues to speak of the specific intelligence and the specific care that went into its making. The ordinary farmers and herders of the Nubian Nile Valley, who do not appear in the royal reliefs or the administrative records, but whose agricultural labor sustained the kingdoms and whose descendants still live in the region of the Upper Nile today, are the most numerous but least visible members of the ancient Nubian world. Their presence in the deeper strata of the archaeological record, in the pottery and the storage pits and the grinding stones and the animal bones of the village sites that punctuate the Nubian landscape, is the evidence for a way of life that sustained itself in one of the more challenging environments of the ancient world across a span of time that dwarfs the duration of any single political entity. The central image of ancient Nubia is the image of the pyramids of Meroe rising from the desert floor in the morning light. There are more than 200 of them, clustered in groups at Meroe and at the sites of Nuri and El Kuru further north, and in the early morning before the day's heat builds the light is horizontal and sharp and the shadows of the pyramids fall long across the sand. The specific experience of visiting the Meroe pyramid field is one that travelers who make the journey describe in terms of genuine surprise and genuine impact. The scale of the pyramid field, with its hundreds of monuments distributed across a significant area of desert, and the specific quality of the desert landscape in which they stand, give the site a character that is quite different from the better-known Egyptian pyramid sites. The isolation of the Meroe site, far from any major modern city and accessible only by means that require genuine commitment, adds to the sense of encountering something that has been waiting patiently for attention that it rarely receives. At Meroe and at the sites of Nuri and El Kuru further north, and in the early morning before the day's heat builds the light is horizontal and sharp and the shadows of the pyramids fall long across the sand. The pyramids are smaller than the Egyptian ones, and they are steeper, their silhouettes more dramatic against the desert sky, and they have the distinctive small chapels attached to their eastern faces where the relief carvings of the Meroitic royal family were made. The most famous image of the Meroe site is the group of pyramids whose tops were destroyed by the 19th-century Italian treasure hunter Giuseppe Ferlini, who demolished the upper portions of more than 40 pyramids in a search for the jewelry he correctly suspected was concealed in the burial chambers. The truncated pyramids, their flat tops giving them a profile unlike any other pyramid field in the ancient world, stand as evidence of the destruction that European antiquarianism visited on the Nubian heritage even as it was claiming to recover the ancient world. But the intact pyramids, and there are many of them, still convey the ambition and the persistence of the Meroitic royal tradition. They were building these monuments for more than 1,000 years, from the 8th century BCE to the 4th century CE, maintaining a tradition of royal commemoration across a span of time that encompasses the rise and fall of the Greek classical world and the Roman Empire. The last pyramid was built after Constantine had legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. The tradition that produced it reached back to the period of the Assyrian conquest of Egypt. What the pyramids of Meroe represent is not an imitation of Egyptian practice or a peripheral echo of a greater civilization to the north. They are the monuments of a civilization that knew what it was doing, that chose to build in this way for its own reasons, and that maintained that choice across a very long period of time. They are African, and they are ancient, and they deserve to be known. The ongoing work of recovering and presenting the Nubian civilizations to a wider audience is a scholarly, curatorial, and political project that is still far from complete. The major international exhibitions on Nubian civilization, including the groundbreaking Sudan, Ancient Kingdoms of the Nile exhibition that toured major museums in Europe and the United States in the 1990s and 2000s, introduced the archaeological achievements of the Nubian civilizations to audiences that had not previously encountered them in the depth that the evidence warrants. The reception of these exhibitions by general audiences has consistently been one of genuine discovery and genuine engagement, suggesting that the neglect of Nubian civilization in popular historical consciousness is not a reflection of lack of interest but of lack of access to the evidence. The audiences who encountered the Nubian material in these exhibitions were not responding to a specialized or niche interest. They were responding to the same qualities of ambition, achievement, and historical significance that make any ancient civilization compelling, qualities that the Nubian civilizations possess in full measure. Including the groundbreaking Sudan, ancient kingdoms of the Nile exhibition that toured major museums in Europe and the United States in the 1990s and 2000s, introduced the archaeological achievements of the Nubian civilizations to audiences that had not previously encountered them in the depth that the evidence warrants. The continued development of the National Museum of Sudan in Khartoum, which holds the principal collection of Nubian archaeological material, and the development of site museums at Meroe and other major Nubian sites, are important dimensions of the ongoing project of making the Nubian heritage accessible. The international community of scholars working on the Nubian civilizations has grown significantly in recent decades, and the development of a specifically Sudanese archaeological tradition, with its own research questions and its own interpretive frameworks, has added important new voices to the conversation about how the Nubian past should be understood and presented. The work of Sudanese archaeologists at sites across the former Nubian kingdoms, and the development of Sudanese university programs that train new generations of scholars in the study of their own civilization's history, are among the more promising developments in a field that has been dominated by outside perspectives for too long. The political instability of Sudan in recent decades has created serious challenges for the preservation and investigation of the Nubian archaeological heritage. Sites that are not under active excavation and protection are vulnerable to looting and to the encroachment of agricultural and urban development, and the resources available to the Sudan Antiquities Service for site protection have often been insufficient to meet the scale of the threat. The international community of scholars and cultural heritage organizations has been working to support the Sudan Antiquities Service and to raise the profile of the Nubian heritage as a matter of international concern, but the work is ongoing and the challenges remain substantial. The future of Nubian studies is one of continued expansion and continued discovery. The specific questions that remain open, including the decipherment of the Meroitic language, the full mapping of the settlement landscape of ancient Nubia, and the development of a complete genetic history of the Nubian population, are all areas where progress is being made and where significant advances can be anticipated in the coming decades. The civilization that built the most durable pyramid tradition in the ancient world is not a story that is finished. The Upper Nile is quiet in the early morning. The river moves through the landscape of northern Sudan with the deliberate pace of a very large river, its surface barely ruffled in the calm before the day's wind builds. On the east bank, near the city of Meroe, the pyramids are already catching the early light, their stone facings long since stripped by time and by the more deliberate attention of treasure hunters, but their profiles still clear and still present against the pale sky. The people who built these pyramids knew what pyramids were. They had seen the great Egyptian ones, or had knowledge of them through the long tradition of Nubian engagement with Egyptian culture. They chose to build in this form, and they maintained that choice across more than 1,000 years and through the careers of dozens of kings. They were not imitating. They were continuing and adapting a tradition that they had made their own, in their own landscape, for their own purposes, in the service of their own beliefs about what it meant to be a ruler and what a ruler's death required. The civilization that built these monuments was ignored for most of the past 3,000 years by the traditions of scholarship that came to define what was worth knowing about the ancient world. Its language is still being worked out. Its script can be read but not understood in all its content. Its kings were pharaohs of Egypt for nearly a century, and that fact is not in most history books. Its pyramids outnumber the Egyptian ones and outlasted the Egyptian tradition by 1,000 years, and most people have never heard of them. The Upper Nile keeps its own time. The river has been flowing through this landscape for longer than any civilization has been keeping records, and the civilizations that grew up along its banks over 3,000 years of documented history are a fraction of the long human story of this specific stretch of water. The pyramids will still be here when the current generation of researchers has finished its work and the next generation has taken their place, and the work of understanding what they mean and what the civilization that built them achieved is work that will continue for as long as anyone is paying attention. The specific indignity of the Meroe pyramids having their tops demolished by a single treasure hunter in the 19th century, a man who went through the pyramid field systematically and destroyed dozens of monuments in a search for gold, is a vivid illustration of how the Nubian heritage has been treated by the outside world across the centuries of its neglect. The tops are gone and cannot be restored. What remains is what has survived, which is still substantial, and the work of understanding and presenting what has survived is the work of the scholars and the institutions that are currently engaged in it. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.